stvari svoje dobre, ja,
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for showing up in such large numbers at yet another Horizons discussion event. Thank you for being guests of the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development, a Belgrade-based global public policy think tank that tries to narrow the gap between Serbia and the world. That is also publishing a journal of international affairs that is called Horizons, and we are using this opportunity to promote the new issue of our magazine. I'm sure you guys all had a chance to take a free copy of the journal. Its main topic is the Belt and Road, the Pledge of the Dragon. It's an interesting publication. Those two guys who I'm going to introduce in a moment have kindly agreed to contribute to the latest publication, but there are also a number of other interesting authors like Li Wei, Minister Li Wei, the president of the Development Research Center of the State Council of the government of China, also Prime Minister Zoran Zaev of Macedonia, as well as His Grace Bishop Ilarion, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Orthodox Church, amongst many others. We're trying to maintain our level. We're trying to bring world-class discussion on foreign affairs to Serbia, and to this end, we are very privileged to have with us very, very special guests who are truly close friends of mine. On my right is Ian Bremmer, the president and founder of the Eurasia Group, which today is one of the leading global political risk research and consulting firms from New York. This is his second visit to Belgrade. I want to remind you that the last time around he was here in 2015 on the occasion of the highly successful launch of the Serbian translation of his newest book, Superpower, The Three Choices for America's Role in the World. In August 2016, Cirsd was also privileged to host Ian Bremmer at a special event held at the Harvard Club in New York when we discussed the state of global affairs in the context of the future of multilateralism. But Ian is world-famous author of the concept of a G0 world, which is a concept that I'm sure we're going to have a chance to touch upon during the course of this evening. He's a prolific thought leader and author, regularly expressing his views on political issues in public speeches, television appearances, and top publications including The Time magazine, where he's currently a foreign affairs columnist and editor-in-large, if I'm not mistaken. He also teaches classes on political risk. He's a professor at the NYU, New York University. And interestingly, he's one of LinkedIn's designated influencers with more than 2.5 million followers. On my left is Kevin Rudd, another dear friend of mine, who is visiting us for the third time in Belgrade, and I'm proud to say every time as a guest of the CIRSD of Cirsd. The last time when he was here in December 2016, just prior to our event, we were having a luncheon at the moment when I was informed that police was at my house willing to bring me in for questioning in a case of a double murder. So that was very exciting last time. So I hope that it's not going to be as exciting this time.
It felt just like home.
Exactly. Well, Kevin served twice as Prime Minister of Australia and also as Foreign Minister. And he was one of the founders of the G20, which was established to drive the global response to the then global financial meltdown. He's a leading international elder statesman, despite his young age. He is considered an elder statesman, but he's first and foremost a first-rate strategic thinker. He's currently serving as president of the Asia Society Policy Institute of New York, a leading global think tank on Asian affairs. Amongst other things, he's a distinguished fellow at the Chatham House in London, also a distinguished statesman at the CSIS in Washington, affiliated with Harvard, Oxford. But he's one of the most experienced and knowledgeable sinologists right now in the world, and the leading architect of Australia's policy of strategic engagement with Beijing. Proficient in Mandarin language. His Mandarin is apparently, people say, better than my English. And he also teaches as a visiting professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing. And last but not least, both of the gentlemen here at the stage are authors, not just in this issue, but in some previous issues of the Horizon. So I ask you to join me in warmly welcoming these two distinguished gentlemen to Belgrade. Well, thank you very much for this, and let's jump straight into the fray. As I said, Ian is at the helm of Eurasia Group, one of the leading world firms on global political risks, and they are publishing every year a publication that is called Global Risks for a year. So I'm going to start by quoting a beginning of the 2018 Global Risk publication by Eurasia Group. And it starts by saying, let's be honest, 2018 does not feel good. Markets are soaring and the economy isn't bad, but citizens are divided. Governments are not doing much governing. So in Serbia, that's probably not the case, but generally speaking, the governments are not doing much governing around the world, and the global order is unraveling. In the last 20 years, the global environment has had its ups and downs. But if we had to pick one year for a big, unexpected crisis, that would be 2018. Now, that goes hand in hand with the opening of the recently completed Munich Security Conference last weekend, and both of you guys were there, where the chairman of the conference, Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger of Germany, said, and I'm quoting him here, "The warning signs are flashing in bright red. The world has moved close to the brink of an interstate conflict." So I want to start this conversation by asking Ian. You said in your global risks report that the number 2 risk is a risk of an accident happening somewhere in the world with potentially devastating consequences. So could you please explain to me an accident? Describe to me an accident somewhere in the world that could lead to a major confrontation.
Well, first of all, it's delightful to be back here and on the stage with 2 dear friends. And I do feel a lot of warmth in this room and a lot of bodies, but I meant it more emotionally. So it's, I think we'll have a lot of fun this evening. You know, we wrote that for January 1. It's now mid-February. Just a few days ago, we had the United States in Syria have a base attacked by Russians. The Americans hit back, and we killed over 200 Russian fighters. That's a pretty big deal. I mean, I don't think we've killed Russians in combat since Vietnam. It barely made news. In the United States, at least. Not many people were talking about it in Munich, but it strikes me as a big deal. You know, Netanyahu just came to a Munich Security Conference, and he brought a prop. I like it when he loves props, right? When he went to the UN, you remember he showed that bomb, and like an actual bomb, like a Wile E. Coyote bomb, but he was using it for the Iranians. This time he brought a piece of the Iranian drone that was shot down from Israeli airspace. And you all know that an Israeli jet then went and they did some bombing in Syria. There was an Israeli jet taken down, and that jet fell into Israeli territory. But what if the jet had fallen into Syrian territory? I think it's pretty clear that you would have had an Israeli pilot that would have been captured by the Assad regime. And how would the Israeli government have responded to that? And what would have happened to Israel-Russia relations, Israel-Iran relations? Might we have had an opening, a renewal of the war with Hezbollah? Might the Israelis have struck Iran directly? North Korea. My friend Kevin thinks that there's a 20% likelihood that we'll end up at war with North Korea. I think it's 10%. I don't know anyone that's serious about this issue that thinks it's lower. That's too high. We've had a year of the Trump administration in a much more fragmented geopolitical order, and so far we haven't had a single crisis, and that's good. I don't really believe that we're going to continue with that sort of luck, given what's happening in the world today. And so as a consequence, when Wolfgang Ischinger, who runs the Munich Security Conference, and it's one thing for me as the political scientist, but Wolfgang is meant to be more diplomatic, more of a statesman standing up there. When he says that the world is on the brink of major interstate conflict, I'd like to believe that world leaders would pay attention, but I will tell you, coming from this conference over the last 3 days with Kevin, every major international issue seems to be escalating, and I didn't hear an awful lot of policy solutions that were being discussed by the leaders in the room.
Thank you, Ian, and I'm going to ask the same question to Kevin. 2018 and a world that is manifestly in flux, the one thing that really bothers you, the one thing that makes you feel nervous with regard to the maintenance of global peace, what would that be?
Well, thank you, thank you, Vuk, and it's good to be back here in Belgrade, and it's good to be back here in Serbia, and to be back here with two good friends who I've known now for many years. On the question of the single thing which would keep me up latest at night during the course of the year ahead, it is the completely uncertain trajectory of North Korea. We've just been through what I think is a period of false calm. It's called the Olympics. It's called this unofficial diplomacy that you've seen on the slopes of the Winter Olympics. Smiling North Koreans, smiling South Koreans, and a very smiling North Korean cheer squad. But you know something, this is the politics of illusion. Underneath that, nothing changes. Underneath that, the North Korean nuclear weapons program continues. Underneath that, the ballistic missile program continues. And underneath that, we therefore end up with three very hard scenarios. One, the United States suddenly decides to accept the legitimacy of North Korea as a bona fide nuclear weapons state, Second is that Chinese diplomacy remarkably, unexpectedly succeeds in causing a fundamental change in North Korean nuclear weapons policy. Or thirdly, the United States initiates one form or other of unilateral strike against North Korea, whether it's a so-called bloody nose strike or something more substantial. If you cut away all the noise, they are the three real scenarios. The problem is, each of them is problematic, and in a strategic environment which is like a tinderbox, in terms of the absence of strategic trust, then we face this continued prospect of conflict by miscalculation. There are multiple additional scenarios which can give rise to that around the world. It can be through the accidental downing of an American aircraft off the Chinese coast, a reconnaissance aircraft. It can be accidents at sea in the South China Sea. And it can be one of a dozen separate scenarios in the Middle East. But the one which I think has the highest risk of escalation from something relatively small and from miscalculation about the reaction from the other side, the strategic zone to observe most closely this year is North Korea.
Well, thanks, Kevin. And all of this is, unfolding in a context of a G0 world. And moreover, something that Ian, you also like to call geopolitical recession. So we know what recession means in economic terms. Could you explain to us what does recession means in geopolitical terms, and why do you think that we're witnessing a geopolitical recession?
It's an unwind of the global order. And look, one thing that's interesting is that the global economy is doing so well, the global markets are doing so well, while the geopolitics are so dangerous. And a lot of people say, well, why is that? And these cycles don't move together. The last time we had an economic recession, it was a really big one, worst since the Great Depression. It was back in 2008. The geopolitical order wasn't so bad in 2008. If you go to 2009, the G20 that we had in April back in London was probably the most coherent and consensus-oriented that the world's leading powers have been since.
Thanks to Kevin, in part.
Absolutely. Well, he can tell you his stories about, sort of being, he'll tell you his stories about being, I won't put words in Kevin's mouth. But the fact is that the United States, look, if you look at America today, the average American today does not support free trade. The average American does not support open borders. The average American does not support the promotion of democracy internationally. And the average American is starting to question the legitimacy of some of America's liberal democratic political institutions. Now, given the fact that the geopolitical order as we experienced it was actually based on a series of institutions and architecture that the Americans created, if the Americans are now moving away from that and actively starting to pull it apart, that's what I'd call a geopolitical recession. If the Europeans are less interested in working together with the Americans, or less capable, and Brexit, clearly, we've had both the Trump election and Brexit since the last time that I had the opportunity to visit you here, Vuk. We had a French election that the first round, at least, was a pretty touch-and-go thing. 15 years ago in Europe, the average, if you took the left and right-wing parties, far left and far right populist parties, put them together, you had about 9%. Now it's 23% across Europe. These trends all put us in the throes of a geopolitical recession. And in a recession, things are more likely to break, depressions become more feasible. And the one thing that perhaps worries me the most, and I know we will get to optimistic things, but we're starting with the more dire side, is that it is precisely the fact that the United States itself is less impacted or feels itself less impacted by this recession. Refugees, whether from Venezuela or from Syria or Iraq or from Myanmar, do not make it to the United States. Terrorism, Islamic terror, is less of a threat in the US than it is in Europe or in Turkey or in Iraq or in Jordan. This means that we don't have an arms race between the Americans and the Canadians or the Americans and the Mexicans. All of this means that a lot of things can unwind and go boom before the Americans feel like they need to take significant action to really reassert themselves internationally. And that means that the likelihood is that this is going to be a much deeper and more prolonged geopolitical recession than we might otherwise experience.
Well, thank you for this. And one element of a geopolitical recession is definitely the withdrawal of the United States. But the other side of the equation is, or like another side of the equation, is certainly a growing China. The most populous country in the world, the second largest economy in the world, the country that had recently held, what many people, including yourself, called the historic Congress of the Communist Party. The 19th Congress of the Communist Party last November, and a grand speech by the Chinese President Xi Jinping caused a lot of attention around the world. And I'm going to quote Ian. Ian said that Xi Jinping's speech in November in Beijing was the most noteworthy and significant geopolitical speech since Gorbachev's speech, in which he officially announced the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He was also mentioning in this speech the fulfillment of China's dream, and also announced for the first time in a fully formal capacity the grand project that is called the Belt and the Road, which is $1 trillion infrastructure project meant to connect East Asia with the shores of Europe. Now, I'm going to turn to Kevin, who is considered, together with Henry Kissinger, one of the world's best experts on China, certainly Western experts on China. So I'm going to ask you, Kevin, do you share Ian's view of the significance of the 19th Congress, of Xi's speech? What is China's dream, and what do you make out of the Belt and Road project?
I think one of the reasons we all feel so anxious about 2018 is that nobody's quite certain anymore what the rules are. That's another way of articulating Ian Bremmer's earlier point about the evolution and the fuller manifestation of a G0 world. Nature abhors a vacuum. International relations abhors a vacuum even more. I think in reality what that means is that when you have a reluctant superpower, as it was the United States under President Obama, what happens is the other major global players and regional players suddenly have unprecedented freedom for maneuver, and no one quite knows what the limits are anymore. And when that is happening simultaneously across multiple theatres, we have genuine, almost definitional instability. If George Bush was an assertive American president, and he was, in response to September 11, Afghanistan, Iraq, and all the strategic miscalculations which Iraq involved, if that was an assertive presidency, it was followed by a reluctant presidency, and now it's followed by an unpredictable presidency. And so therefore we have an unprecedented sense that there is no one comprehensively and consistently in charge anymore. And that's a palpable feeling in international relations on the part of decision makers. So what's the Chinese dimension in the middle of that? The Chinese have a remarkable Marxist phrase, which I think derives from earlier sort of Soviet parentage in describing their position in international relations today. They describe the current period as an enormous period of strategic opportunity. And they see this as a global environment where, because of the relative decline of American power as they perceive it, both as an objective phenomenon but also in the subjective exercise of power, that because of the growing multipolarity of the international system, this provides much more global and regional policy room for China to move than has been the case in the past. And this is one deep assumption within Chinese thinking. And the second is this: if you have greater room to move, then what do you do with that, which goes to the heart of your question as to what Chinese strategy is. Therefore, what is the dream? I think in 2 or 3 ways it's a bit like this. Number one, China now, with each of its 14 land borders, becoming increasingly assertive about the sort of relationship it expects with its neighbouring states. China wants to have comfortable, secure land borders, but it wants those relationships also to be conducted in a way which maximises China's interests. Number two, you see a much more concerted effort on the part of the Chinese, particularly vis-a-vis their military capabilities and the exercise of it, to push the parameters out into the Western Pacific more, to ensure that this is no longer seen by the rest of the region as an American lake. And that is felt across Asia. And the third is what you've referred to before, which is the Belt and Road Initiative, which doesn't head out into the maritime zone. It heads to the continental zone surrounding China, heading west across the Eurasian continent and through Central Europe, Eastern Europe, the Balkans, into Western Europe, and through the Middle East and into East Africa as well. And that is where China senses, with some Russian reservations, that there is a strategic opportunity as well to expand China's zone of economic influence. So if I was to try and render the arms of the external reach of the China dream, that's how we're perceiving it at present. And one concluding sentence is, also with the emergence for the first time of Chinese individual diplomatic initiatives to deal with problems in various parts of the world, and also emerging Chinese ideas about the reform of the existing post-45 international rules-based system. And these are new developments.
Well, thanks, Kevin, for these deep thoughts. And I'm going to turn to Ian now, and I'm going to ask you about, and just to follow up on what Kevin said. Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you about a potential, and if you ask me, very natural rivalry between the two world's most populous states. One is China and the other is India. And there were frictions in the past, and right now there's kind of a cold peace between the two. But we're talking about 21st century, and we're talking about two countries that are over 1 billion people, and that have very different political systems, that have reasonably different cultural and historical backgrounds. And there is an emerging, it seems that there is an emerging rivalry these days in a place which not too many people know for anything else, but very exotic vacation location, not reachable to many, and that is Maldives. We have a
You don't have a direct from Air
crisis.
Serbia yet going there?
Not yet, not yet.
Yeah.
It's only the private jets.
You better hurry because the waters are rising. You know, it's
The government guys are going there very often. But to be serious, President Abdullahian had his quarrels and actually incarcerated the former president Mohammad Nasheed. And Mohammad Nasheed called for an Indian military intervention. But President Yahim is very strongly supported by China. Mm-hmm. So very briefly, do you see the crisis playing out in the Maldives, but much more importantly, how do you see the geopolitical equation between India and China in the context of Pakistan and much else?
Well, look, I mean, the obvious thing is that 30 years ago, even 20 years ago, I remember in The Economist cover stories that talked about India and China as if they were the rising giants. It's ludicrous to talk about them.
Dragon.
That's right, and it's ludicrous to talk about them in that way today. The Chinese are this year going to be spending 10 times the amount of money as the Indians on domestic infrastructure. They're that far behind. The Chinese, together with the United States, are now a superpower in technology and AI. The Chinese aren't even on the map. They're not even top 10. And the Chinese economically are outspending everyone internationally. The Belt Road Initiative that you and Kevin just talked about, the Indians just don't have that capacity. And so, you know, when you look at a place like the Maldives, which, you know, before the Indians actually effectively have intervened militarily to prevent a coup in the past, but that was when they were dominating economically. They're not anymore. Sri Lanka, the Indians had natural political, cultural ties and affinity, but the Chinese are overwhelming them economically. And I think that even though Modi's relationship with Trump is pretty good, his relationship with the US is clearly improving. His best relationship in the world now is with Shinzo Abe in Japan, so a very good relationship with Australia. Kevin knows a lot more about that, obviously. But the Indians are not ready to play big-time geopolitics. And so if the Chinese tell them to back down on something that isn't critical, they're going to try to find a face-saving mechanism. And that's what we've seen in the Maldives, and that's what we saw over contested territory in Bhutan last year. So, I mean, this is a piece of good news, frankly. I think that China is in a strong position. They know that time is on their side. They don't need to act overly aggressive for their own domestic political purposes. And the Indians, I think, are quite understandably very tentative to do so. So I'd be very surprised to see major power conflict between India and China become dangerous in the near future.
So I'm going to stay with you because I want to ask you now something that is not terribly related to that, but it is very interesting here in Serbia.
Don't ask me about Burundi and the Kosovo. He did this to me. He didn't. I got a question today. I didn't know that Burundi had turned back on Kosovo. I was flat-footed.
But that was a trick question, and I don't want to trick you in front of the audience.
Okay. Because now I know everything. I Googled it, and I'm an expert. But yeah.
Long live Burundi.
Burundi's in Africa. I just wanted to tell you that.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. Trump did not know that, by the way. I just want to.
Did he know where Africa was?
Burundi's a courageous nation in Africa.
You're losing control.
That is going to join many others. But I'm going to ask you about the United States, and I'm going to ask you about what is really giving thrills to the entire world, and that is Russia's investigation and the recent indictment of the special prosecutor Mueller of 13 Russian individuals and entities about the alleged Russian interference in the United States election. And I know it's a big deal in America these days, and I actually took time to carefully read the indictment by the special prosecutor, and it says something that kind of raises eyebrows. It talks about Russian interference, and allegedly there are a lot of bad and clearly illegal things that were taking place conducted by certain Russian individuals. But two things really caught my attention. They are talking about the annual budget of the operation that runs in millions of dollars. And they're also talking about hundreds of fakes accounts at social networks that is called bots. It's not totally unknown here in Serbia what are bots. But it talks about millions of dollars that the Russians have invested in this operation. Now, if I'm not mistaken, the two candidates in the last election, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, each spent in excess of $1 billion for their campaign efforts. So could you explain to me how can investment of millions of dollars decisively influence the result of an American election in which billions of dollars were actually spent?
Well, first, you know the Russian diaspora vote is very important in swing states, and you know, that's part of
Yeah.
it. Okay, no one thought that was
the
funny.
breaker.
No, I'm sorry. So I want to start answering this by, I'm going to tell you a little personal story that involves Kevin.
Oh.
I wonder if Kevin knows what story I'm about to tell. Do you know what story I'm about to tell?
No.
Okay.
Good.
So you all remember the secret second meeting between Trump and Putin at the G20, right?
In the loop.
What?
Yeah, the one
in the
in the
bathroom. No,
bathroom.
it wasn't at the bathroom. I'm talking about the one at dinner.
Oh.
When they went across the table for an hour, right, and spoke to each other, and no one had disclosed that. I disclosed that. I found out about it from 3 people among the heads of state and heads of international organizations who were at the meeting. And after I broke the news, Kevin was over for dinner, and we were talking over drinks, just us and my wife.
Trump was not at the dinner.
Trump was not at the dinner. And Kevin said, so where did you find out? Where did you find out? And I said, well, I heard actually from 3 people, but I shouldn't tell you. He said, no. He said, I'm going to guess. And he took 5 minutes, and Kevin went 1, 2, 3, and actually knew who I had heard from. And that, I shouldn't have been surprised because of Kevin, but I was duly impressed by that. So anyway, but what's interesting about that story is that story dominated news in the United States for an entire week, and it really shouldn't have. I mean, it was interesting because, you know, you would think that Trump would want to talk to his allies, and instead he got bored and it was a long dinner, so he went across the table and spent almost an hour talking to Putin. He didn't have his translator because there wasn't, so the Russians had a contemporaneous report and transcript, the Americans didn't, but it didn't deserve a week. And the reason it got a week is because the Americans have gone...
Sounds like Trump is a more interesting, Putin is a more interesting interlocutor to Trump than any of the allies of the United States.
He was seated next to the Japanese prime minister's wife, who speaks English but pretended not to because she hates Trump. And he was getting really bored, and he had dealt with the allies all the last 2 days, and he's like, you know, at least Putin kind of, you know, we get along. So it was interesting. But the point is that the American media has gone completely crazy about this story on both sides. It's like Brexit in the UK. It's all people are talking about, even though like no one else cares, right? But it's all they're talking about. And you know, now you have this investigation, and it is absolutely true, Vuk, that the Russians spent millions of dollars, clearly at the behest of the Kremlin, to try to delegitimize the election. Did they swing the election on the basis of a couple $1 million, $5 million, $10 million? Of course not. Were they doing things they shouldn't have done that Obama should have responded to? Yes, he should have. And I think he knows he made a mistake. Should Trump recognize...
What could he do?
Oh, I mean, what could he have done? First of all, he didn't say anything about it for a while. When he did, he linked it to the Russians harassing some American diplomats in Moscow, so he watered it down, and then he threw a few sanctions on. If the Russians are going to do cyber attacks on the U.S., including, for example, hacks against Podesta, the former Clinton campaign manager, and then throw them out there. We should be taking some information that we have on Putin's family and key oligarchs, and we should be making it public. Maybe we seize a little real estate that they enjoy traveling to so much. We know how to hit these people. I mean, we're the world's superpower, and we're just going to let them do that and not care? No, 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 no. No, but the issue is, I mean, we know that Obama can be a weenie around some of this stuff, right?
Did
term.
you say a weenie?
Can be, yes.
Can be.
Can be.
How do you define weenie in international relations theory?
A weenie can be someone that thinks and doesn't like to lead, as opposed to Bush, who is someone that leads and doesn't like to think.
So that's the definition of the reluctant presidency.
Reluctant president. Or
Yes.
leading from behind.
Yes.
So, no.
And now we have both, which is exciting. So where was I? Where was I? Seriously, I forgot where I just was.
Weenie.
Weenie. Oh, so Obama. No. But so Trump comes in, and it's fairly obvious, right, that Trump should be worried about the fact that he has all of these people that were on his staff and running his campaign who were on the Russian payroll. Like, that's bad. It's not collusion. And let me be very clear. There is no collusion. Trump keeps talking about collusion because he knows there was no collusion. Pay attention to this, don't pay attention to that. You know how we know there was no collusion? It's very simple. Because the Russians were spending money and putting high-level people to try to get in touch with absolute idiots like Carter Page, right? To get to Trump. If they had already gotten to Trump, they would not be talking to Carter Page to get to Trump, right? So we know there was no collusion, but we also know that there were a number of people that were around Trump, that Trump was covering up for, that he was lying for, and we know the investigation is a very big deal. It's going to keep going. And the thing that we know that bothers me the most is that Trump has done something very smart politically, which he has managed to cajole the Republican leadership into becoming complicit with him in undermining the legitimacy of the FBI, the Department of Justice, and the investigation, to promote the idea of fake news, to ensure that the Americans do not know what to believe. This is something the Russians are much better at than the Americans, and we know that it deeply undermines the fabric of liberal democracy. And if there's anything that bothers me about what's happening in the United States right now under Trump, it is that process is being actively led by and facilitated by the Trump administration. That's why this Russian stuff matters.
Do you think Trump is going to be reelected?
Look, he's 72, he's morbidly obese, his family doesn't love him, so he could die. But if you take the actuarial tables out of it, I think slightly more than 50% chance he probably is reelected.
Now, I'm going to pick on your observation about liberal.
It's Kevin's
democracy.
turn.
I know.
I'm kind of enjoying this.
No,
Just let it roll.
But you asked a question. You raised an issue. So actually, I will turn to Kevin. But I'm gonna keep the issue. I'm gonna keep the issue that you did raise, and that is the issue of the future, or like the crisis of liberal democracy in the future, of the concept of liberal democracy. I'm going to give you a chance to respond to what Kevin is going to say. Kevin, do you think that liberal democracy is in crisis? And do you think that there is a chance that it comes back? And if so, what it would take for a liberal democracy to come back?
Can I add one footnote on the Russia thing and then come to the question you've just asked? Ian, I think, eloquently has described the impact of the Russia phenomenon on US domestic politics. And I think he's absolutely accurate. I now live in New York, and I try and understand this thing every day as I observe it. But the international dimension of it in terms of the future of US-Russia relations is, I think, a problem of parallel significance. We've now had a dysfunctional US-Russia relationship for a long time, a very long time. And not only do we see the strategic outworkings of that in terms of the Ukraine and in Syria, but now we're reaching this very difficult time, as we discussed at the Munich Security Conference, where we are looking at the real prospect of a new nuclear arms race as well. Existing nuclear arms limitation treaties, such as the INF Treaty and START, are up for renewal, and an absence of political will to renew them. We have also now significant pressures in the United States for the active deployment of tactical nuclear weapons, changes emerging in nuclear doctrine, and the nuclear question is now out of the cage in a way which I have not seen it since the end of the Cold War. This is a profound dysfunctionality for all of us coming out of the nature of the US-Russia relationship, which, given what's happened with the Mueller investigations and the actions which they are investigating, means that it's not going to get better anytime soon. It'll be as bad in this administration as it was in the last one and for most of the previous one. But the stakes are now high. On liberal democracy, I think there are two questions at stake for the future of liberal democracies. The first point I'd make, however, is that liberal democracies are worth fighting for. They're horribly imperfect, but when you look at where we've got to with the liberal democratic project over several hundred years, it certainly beats most of the alternatives that are on offer. Not perfect, doesn't deliver the goods all the time, but against the alternatives, not bad. So what are the two big challenges that I see? One, in its own way, is pointed to by the French Marxist economist Piketty in terms of what's happening with equality and what's happening with the future of employment and living standards for working people and the middle class, even before the artificial intelligence revolution takes hold. And that is, larger and larger numbers of people are no longer seeing themselves as having a future in the liberal democratic project or the liberal capitalist project more broadly. And this is getting more acute. We've ceased to see the neat labour substitution effect that we've seen in previous generations of technological change as people lose jobs in one sector to find better jobs in new sectors over time. The decline of that labour substitution effect has been mapped now basically since the global financial crisis of a decade ago. Larry Summers has written papers on this in the United States. I'm no Marxist, but Marx has one profound insight in terms of the impact of underlying economic structures on the rest of, let's call it, society and its politics. And this structure is creating a whole bunch of new contradictions, which are really problematic. So unless there can be an economic reinvention of liberal capitalism in a social democratic direction, with greater distribution of wealth to working people, and not just the concentration of wealth in profits, then I think these fractures underpinning liberal democracies will get sharper and starker. And these folks who are not getting anything out of it will increasingly be appealed to by the politics of race and the politics of the extreme. The second factor is equally problematic, which is the disappearance of effective common objective medium for communication within democracies around common subjects, common facts, a common basis for common dialogue within political systems. And instead you see things being atomized completely, not just into their own individual social media worlds, but now, courtesy of what's happened in recent years the world of facts, non-facts, partial facts, the very basis for a discourse within a democracy becomes shattered. And so those two factors, an economic fundamental, plus, I think, the dispersion of the means of discourse within a democracy to enable democracies to function, these are tearing away at the fabric. Both are fixable if we have a mind to do so.
That's very thoughtful, but I'm going to try and simplify this in my question to Ian. Does the United States care about democracy and liberal democracy outside the United States anymore?
I don't know that America knows the answer to that. I think if you ask the average American today what American values are, the country is very deeply divided. I'll give you an example. Nancy Pelosi came out last year. She was hammering about Bernie Sanders, who she denounced as a socialist. She said, America's a capitalist country. We're a capitalist nation. Our people are capitalists. I got to tell you, I grew up in the projects. We didn't have capital.
What's the projects, for those of us who don't know what they are?
Public housing, poor people, not our places, subsidized. And you don't have any capital, you're not a capitalist. You want generally to work at a reasonable job and get fair wages and have a better chance for your kids. And I think that, absolutely the average American is prepared to care about human rights. The average American, I think, is generous of soul, is kind of heart. But they're going to, if you're not taking care of their families, if the school system is falling apart, if the infrastructure is falling apart, if you've got gun violence, which makes a mockery of every advanced industrial democracy in the world, and you can't do anything about it because of vested interests and big money, you're going to stop caring about promoting democracy in places you can't pronounce and find on a map. That's
Burundi, Serbia.
For example, Venezuela. The United States is so far not willing to even stop importing oil from one of the world's most brutal dictatorships because it might cost a penny on the pump. Do you know one of the most depressing statistics I've seen all year was that the average Venezuelan citizen lost 17 pounds of weight last year because they couldn't get enough food. So when we tell the Chinese they need to stop providing energy to the North Koreans, but we're going to keep buying it from Venezuela because, hey, our people might suffer, it's not because the Americans don't care, but it is because if you're not taking care of your family first, you're not going to care as much. And I think that the fact that the average American increasingly believes that the entire establishment, professors, media, corporate leaders, bankers, and political leaders have been lying to them for decades. And even if they've not been lying, they fundamentally don't care, has changed the view and the willingness of the average American. It's why America First worked so well as a slogan, because people felt it was broken and no one was looking out for them. And even if Trump doesn't end up helping them, and the tax plan will not help them, in my view. I'm all in favor of lower corporate taxation, by the way. Christine Lagarde said it's going to help global growth, help American growth, yes. But blowing out the budget the way you are for mostly reduced taxes for wealthy people means in 2 to 4 years, probably after the 2020 elections, Congress is going to come back and say, we're spending too much, we've got to reduce all these benefits for the working and middle class people that voted for Trump. And that is a horrible thing, but Trump is saying and acting in ways that resonate with the base that feel like they have been forgotten. And Obama, for many of them, especially many of those white Americans, when Trump says, you black Americans, football players, millionaires, how dare you, we let you make all this money, how dare you not kneel for our national anthem? And that's what he's saying.
How dare you kneel?
How dare you kneel? How dare you not stand for all the white fans that are watching and the white owners and the white coaches? It kills me to see him play and prey on Americans that way, but it works. And it works Not because Trump is a bad guy. It works because Americans in leadership positions, including me, for the last 30 years have not recognized and done enough about this problem. That is where the blame is. It's not on Trump.
Well, it does remind me. I can also think of a guy who says the things that you'd really like to hear, and some of them are difficult to swallow, closer to home ground. I need to accelerate this because we only have 10 more minutes before I give it over to the floor. But the one thing that I really don't want to miss on, and I'm going to pick Kevin on this. Now is almost March 1 of 2018. So I want you to imagine March 1, 2019. I want you to fast forward 12 months. And I want to ask you, do you think that on March 1, 2019, the United Kingdom will no longer be the member of the European Union?
On the balance of probabilities, they will not be.
So how do you think this is going to play out? Very quickly. I know it's a very complex question, but is that going to be a hard way out, or do you think that the Europeans and the British are going to be able to find a way of avoiding a disaster?
Politics in the end will prevail, and it will not be a hard exit, but it will still be a difficult exit. Secondly, it will impact badly on the British economy. And thirdly, there is a degree of denial in Britain about their ability to recover effectively from this. I worry deeply about the future global competitiveness of Britain, and I'm not sure that the British political establishment understand how much of a national suicide note they've signed.
So, but let me ask you a question. What is the message of a hard and a very painful Brexit to those that are still aspiring to join the European Union with good or bad chances to fulfill this dream? If the United Kingdom, the permanent member of the Security Council, one of the largest economies in the world, if the price for their exit is close to suicidal, do you think that this is going to scare off people who are thinking about whether to join or not? Because if the British can't decide to get out of that place without paying a huge and significant price, like what's left for the other?
Well, the British suffer from the delusion that you can have your cake and eat it too on this question, that you can be fully positioned to take every advantage of being a full member of Europe and still being separate from Europe. It doesn't work that way. That is a British self-delusion. By the way, I'm of complete British stock historically. I know these folk very well. I'm in London a lot. That's the problem. So for other states which are aspirants to become full members of the European Union, I think that is a good thing, not a bad thing. It's not because I think that the Brussels bureaucracy is wonderful. It's not. But anyone with a passing knowledge of the history of this continent knows that a unified Europe under the Treaty of Rome is infinitely better than the centuries of bloodshed we've seen in Europe beforehand. And the idea put together after 45 by Monnet and the rest, and Schuman and the rest, and then Adenauer and the rest, was the right idea for Europe's future. By bringing together a common destiny, first on the economy and then on politics and then on foreign and security policy, against everything that has preceded it, it is infinitely better. The problem with so much of the arid debate on Europe, particularly in Britain, is that it's a debate about, the perfect versus the good. Well, I'm in politics. It's never perfect. If you get a 65% outcome, that's heaven. You get a 51% outcome, that's pretty good. Even 49%, you can sometimes squeeze by. And so I think that's the problem. So for countries like Serbia, for countries in the Western Balkans who are aspiring to membership of the European Union, I would encourage you, the opportunities which it provides are, I think, fundamental. And they are transformational over time in the way in which national political systems think about themselves. I think the idea is still a good one. And I say that as an external observer. I'm a friend of Europe. Australia is quite a way away. But I think it's worth being part of. I think the alternatives in the dismemberment of Europe take us back to a terrible period in history.
It's a very divisive issue here, but thank you very much for providing this very insightful angle. Now I'm going to fast forward to a trick question that I thought up for both of you. So I'm going to explain to you the strict rules. You have to answer with a yes or no. It's like taking a binary bet. You can either say yes or no. So nothing else is accepted. So I don't know, hard to say, depends on developments and so on and so forth. You just need to say yes or no. Depends on your
maybe.
guts and
Maybe?
instincts.
Is that okay?
No, maybe is not allowed. Maybe is not allowed to make things even more interesting. So I'm going to give you some countries. I'm going to ask you a country by country.
The last time I played this game was in the 2008 presidential election in the United States, in the lead up to deciding whether it was going to be Obama or Hillary Clinton would be the candidate. And then I predicted, of course, that it would be Hillary.
Good.
And then I had to work with Obama for the next X years.
I can totally feel your pain. I did the same for Kerry in 2004. So I can totally relate to your pain, but I'm not terribly sympathetic. So I'm going to still insist on the yes or no answers. So a country that I'm going to read to you, yes or no, in 10 years from now, what do you think? Is it going to stay in the same borders that it currently has? I'm going to start off by Ian, and I'm going to say Iraq.
No.
Kevin, the United Kingdom.
No.
Wow. Ian, Spain.
Yes.
Kevin, Albania.
Yes.
Ian, Bosnia.
No.
Kevin, Ukraine.
Sort of.
No, that's not acceptable.
But we don't know what their borders are now. It's hard.
That's fair enough.
That was going to be my methodological challenge.
Cool. Okay, so that was very, very significant what you just said. I'm not going to ask you follow-up questions on this. I intended to, but let's stay this way. I'm going to close my rounds of questions before I turn over to the audience by asking you something that I also asked Richard Haas, who was our previous guest a couple of weeks ago here in Belgrade. The world is in flux and it's all in depression and all that. But if you had to name one person, in your opinion, who is currently the world's most influential leader, what would that be, Ian? Who would that be?
Influential? Xi Jinping.
And Kevin?
Xi Jinping.
Good. That was awesome. Now I am going to give the opportunity to our crowd who had patiently waited out for this opportunity to ask questions. I'm going to allow a few questions from the audience. So start by presenting yourself, saying who you are, and please remember that a question ends with a question mark. So my friend Dmitry Voinov, who I didn't give a floor last time, but now he's asking. He's a famous director, as a matter of fact.
Good evening. I have a question regarding North Korea. In the beginning of the,
Who are you asking?
I'm asking both of you, or you can choose your preference, because I'm not sure who is more competent for this question. Since the beginning of their nuclear program, and especially their missile program, in the beginning, it was treated as something that is potentially dangerous, but maybe even more to themselves or maybe to their closest neighbors. And then in a short while, the paradigm shifted and sort of became presented, their missile program became presented as a sort of realistic deterrent to the United States. So what I'm asking you is that since that shift came in a very short time, does that mean that there was a genuine technological progress that happened, or that maybe a silent partner appeared and helped North Koreans bridge that gap and get to a technological progress? Or simply is it just a political decision to treat that threat as something more serious than as it was initially perceived? Thank you very much.
Do you want to take this, or like both of you?
The material progress in the North Korean program is clear, since really it began in earnest in around about 1994. The recent advances have been turbocharged by the domestic research and development effort within North Korea. There has been external assistance, but it is difficult to quantify where exactly it has all come from. But the result is clear. Missile range has improved, missile accuracy has improved, and we now have the capacity for possibly the deployment of multiple independent re-entry vehicles as well. Enough to cause the American national security establishment to conclude that we are within a year of critical thresholds being crossed in terms of real threats to proximate American territories, Guam, and then of course heading further east to the American West Coast. I think that is the material change. This ultimately, for the last decade, has been a technical question. When would North Korea cross these lines? But now with 40 to 50 nuclear bombs in their possession, and on top of that, a large number of missiles, short, medium, and evolving ICBM length, this is a real phenomenon. It's a fact. It's material circumstances changing on the ground.
Thank you, Kevin. Now I'm going to give a floor to Brad Sadler, my good friend, who was for many, many years a very famous CNN anchor. Now he leads a television network here in Serbia that is called N1. Brad.
Hi. Well, first of all, just talking what Kevin was referring to on Brexit, I have two passports, British and Serbian. So I hope my Serbian passport crosses the finish line one day. Now, being a former journalist, I'm going to ask, of course, two questions. They will have a question mark at the end, one to Kevin, one to Ian. First of all, Kevin, you were talking about the destruction of communications fabric in democracy, and you hope we'll get to a point where we can fix it. I actually think we might just be beyond the point of fixing it. So my question to you is, if the point of fixing it has now passed or is about to pass, how do you see democracy and elections? We have a Belgrade election here very soon, and we have one in Lebanon, and I have a question about you that next, Ian. How do you see democracy functioning under a new way of communicating between peoples through social media, the atomization, as you nicely put it, of the way issues are being dealt with at the global level? That's for you, please, Kevin. Ian, for you. Last time you were here, we talked about Saudi Arabia and the emergence of the succession there. Succession issue much clearer now, of course, with Mohammed bin Salman. The removal of Saad Hariri, who was the Prime Minister of Lebanon, some say he was kidnapped. You and I could talk about that ad infinitum. But with the specter of war between Israel, Iran, Syria, Hezbollah particularly, elections there in May in Lebanon, I want to see what you think about is the trigger point and whether or not there was a mistake made by Riyadh and MBS Mohammed bin Salman over the Hariri resignation. Thank you.
Fascinating. Let's start out by Kevin.
I think one, I don't accept the premise that we've crossed the threshold yet, but if we have, the most immediate consequence is the rolling perceived delegitimization of elections everywhere, including in those of us who are among the oldest continuing democracies, such as Australia, the United States, the United Kingdom, and elsewhere. And that is a threshold, therefore, I'm not prepared to concede that we have crossed. Secondly, therefore, to answer the question in a different way, what are the fight-back mechanisms to prevent that from occurring? I think the innovative work which is now done around the business of independent fact-checking will become increasingly important in all functioning democracies, and will take, I think, more and more rigorous forms to bring some discipline into national debates. Secondly, new legislation, new laws such as those which have been just introduced into Germany, I suggest a pushback by democratic states in the other direction. Will this work? I think it can. Will it be phenomenally difficult? Of course it will. But remember, there's now a general feeling of angst about the doctrine of absolute freedom of, let's call it, saying anything at any time about anyone, whatever the factual basis, which has been unleashed by Google, Facebook, and the rest. And these corporations now know that they're in global corporate trouble as a result. So the pushback's happening. And I think we're going to have a false civil libertarian debate about restrictions on their freedom. I'm all for creating profitable firms, but if we're going to underwrite Google's and Facebook's profitability by screwing our democracies on the way through, I'm all for, frankly, asserting some constraints.
Thanks. Ian, Lebanon.
It was quite something, as television goes. I mean, Hariri leaves Lebanon, shows up in Saudi Arabia, says he has resigned. A couple days later, does a press conference with Saudi television, and he's asked, sort of, you resigned voluntarily, and he goes, yes, I have, and then he looks off screen to make sure that was the right answer. It was, it certainly felt strange. And then, of course, a few days later, he's back. He's prime minister again. It's kind of, we do this in the United States when we go fishing. If you get one that's too small, you catch, you release, right? That's basically what happened in Lebanon. The Saudis, look, I will tell you that I believe that Mohammed bin Salman is embarking on something transformational and revolutionary. At home, I believe in at least 90% of what he's doing. He is trying to reform political Islam. It desperately needs to happen. Other countries haven't taken it on. He's bringing women into the workplace. Only 20% actually are in the workplace right now. It's appalling. He's letting them drive. A little late, but it needs to happen. He's opening cinemas so young Saudi men and women have something to do. In fact, the fact is that I think that part of the dissent that we've seen in Iran is because the comparatively cosmopolitan Iranians saw that men and women could be in stadiums together in Saudi Arabia, and they go, wait a second, what's happening here with all of our problems? And they agitated for more, so I give them credit. But internationally, Mohammed bin Salman has made big mistakes, and he has not been helped by the president and the president's son-in-law. By the way, I liked it when Trump told Jared that he was going to fix Israel-Palestine, right? Because it's completely impossible, so put him there, right? Much better than having Kerry doing it for 18 months, who's a capable diplomat, and then you say you're going to literally waste all of your time on that as opposed to other things. With Jared, it was a useful distraction. But when I remember, Trump makes his first trip to Riyadh, and he's hearing from the Saudis and the Emiratis, Qatar's horrible, they're evil, they're supporting Iran, they're as bad as ISIS. Now, Trump does not know that Qatar has the most important U.S. military base in the region. He doesn't know that. And to be fair, I know people that do reality television and do real estate, and most of them don't know that, right? So you wouldn't expect him to know that, except those others aren't president, right? So he immediately says, absolutely, Qatar's horrible, cut him down, do what we need, you guys are awesome, you just treat him like a king. And basically, they cut off diplomatic and economic relations with the Qataris. And almost immediately, Rex Tillerson, who has been, ExxonMobil, has been working with Qatar for decades, says, oh my God, like this is a disaster. Mattis, who is, I think, the most effective Secretary of Defense the US has had in decades, and certainly not just from a policy perspective, but morale in the Pentagon is very high, also says this is a disaster. They both try to get it back, and it's too late. And now we still have this now frozen conflict for a year between the Qataris, almost a year, the Qataris and the Saudis and the Emiratis, and clearly not in America's interest, not in the interest of stability in the region. So, I mean, the response to you is that even though the people around Trump on national security, I think, are pretty good, they're pretty competent, he largely defers to him, Trump's lack of impulse control and lack of knowledge occasionally leads to miscalculations. That heightens risks. And in Saudi Arabia, with a young, somewhat hot-headed, and risk-acceptant crown prince, even though he's doing mostly all the right things at home, it's really caused a lot of frictions and instability in the region more broadly. And I do worry that that's something we could see more of, including in Lebanon going forward.
And Ian, come on, like, I can accept that Trump didn't really enter the White House with highly sophisticated knowledge of the world history and current affairs. But he's still he's the president of the United States. Like, there are people who do know about things. So aren't they telling him? Are they explaining things to him?
Look, I'll give you two examples. So first of all, I remember when Trump was going down to Mar-a-Lago when he was running for office. And remember, there were 17 Republicans. So no one thought Trump was going to win, so he could not get a good team, right? There was a big Republican foreign policy establishment. Nobody wanted to go work for this guy. And Jared is trying to give him some stuff on China, has a few briefing papers, just the executive notes on it. Trump looks at it, sees they disagree with him, throws it back at Jared and says, these people disagree with me, but I have a plane and I have Mar-a-Lago. They don't. I'm right. So go find a China expert that agrees with me. Well, Jared's like, I don't know. So he goes on Google and he tries to find one. And he does. Peter Navarro, who I've known for a long time. He's an economist at UC Irvine. Nice guy, a little fringe, not stupid, but really, really hawkish, and was the one guy that was out there saying Trump's right on China. So Peter Navarro, no political experience, gets a phone call from Jared saying, hey, you want to be our advisor on trade?
You're not exaggerating.
It's 100% true. Now, I then saw Peter 5-6 months later at the Republican National Convention. We get together for a while, we have a drink, and I asked him about his Trump relationship because he was talking to Jared once a week, at least twice a week. He had not at that point either met with or spoken to Trump 5-6 months later. Trump absolutely digests an enormous amount of information. It's not like he doesn't like information, but on balance, it needs to validate things he already believes. And everyone around him that has attempted to brief him, engage with him on things requiring expertise, has recognized that that's an enormous problem. And the attention span is also relatively limited for facts he doesn't care about. Now, by the way, for facts he does care about, so for example, around real estate, around sort of business transactions, the rest, the guy's not stupid at all, and his political instincts are extraordinarily well honed. But when you talk about a military base of the United States in Qatar, he has virtually no interest, and if it doesn't support his narrative, he doesn't care. And again, on balance, so far in the last 12 months, when there's been a problem on national security, Trump has said, generals do it. So on Syria, I mean, look, Obama dithered for over a month on, I know I said red line on chemical weapons, but I don't know if I want to do it, and I need the Brits, but the Brits aren't supporting me now, and well, the French, but they're not enough, and Congress, I'm going to have a vote, no, I'm not going to have a vote, and he doesn't do it. Trump says, generals, what do you want to do? And they say, let's hit them. Here we go. And Trump says, awesome. Do it during dessert while I'm with Xi Jinping, 2 birds, 1 stone, and it works. I think everyone can admit that that response to Syrian use of chemical weapons was more effective than what Obama did. But let us not pretend that it's because Trump had facility with the information.
because he did not. It's because he had good generals and he went to them. In the case of Qatar, he was played by the Saudis and the Emiratis, and it didn't work out to America's interests. I hope that doesn't happen on North Korea.
Wow, that is fascinating. Maya wanted to ask the question. He's the fellow at the East-West Institute, representative actually of the East-West Institute here in Belgrade.
Should I wait for Mike?
Yeah, just wait for the mic. That's going to be the penultimate question, one before last. So think hard whilst Maya's asking the question. There's going to be one more question in the room. Think hard.
First of all, thank you so much for fascinating discussion. Very quickly, I'm not a journalist, so I start with a question. 16 plus 1. Impressive investment, 3 billion fund, 10 billion credit.
16 plus 1 refers to the Central East Europe relationship. 16 countries of Central and Eastern Europe with Beijing. Beijing is one. 16 are European countries, just to make sure that everybody understands
including
here.
the Balkans.
Including the Balkan countries.
Should the region, the Balkans, embrace this investment? Should EU be concerned, as EU is concerned? Why is US warning us about 16 plus 1? How come Russians are not reacting? Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. I'm going to ask this Kevin. Kevin's the dragon here.
The what?
The dragon.
The dragon.
Like everything, yeah.
Your last part of your question was kind of interesting, where you said, what about Russia? It's very interesting when the Belt and Road Initiative was announced, and I'll come to 16 plus 1 in a minute. When the Belt and Road Initiative was first announced some years ago, unofficially, the reaction from the Kremlin was very negative. Why? Because it cut directly across Russia's historical interests and institutional arrangements in Central Asia and more broadly. And the question which went to the Kremlin, went to the Chinese leadership in Zhongnanhai and Beijing was, please explain. This led to a very complex and difficult period in the Putin-Xi Jinping relationship, which has been not discussed much. And a modus, an agreement was reached that Russian support for the BRI, as it became known, then called OBOR, the
One Belt, One Road.
One Belt, One Road, would have built within it a dispute resolution mechanism between Moscow and Beijing when core interests were going to intersect or be challenged in terms of Russia's pre-existing arrangements in the Eurasian Economic Union, etc. So put that as a piece of background information. Some deep strategic disagreement over China moving in strategically into historically a Russian sphere of influence, as Moscow saw it. Far be it from me to provide you Europeans with advice about 16 plus 1. You make your own collective and individual judgments. I would say this, however, on balance. China comes wanting to invest in infrastructure across the wider region. If there are alternative sources of investment capital, then I'm sure you would have all pursued them. If they are not readily apparent, and China is offering to build infrastructure which is needed, then I think my approach would be to engage and to deploy. But here's the condition, that you do so on the basis of what you calculate to be in your own local interests, project by project. What are the management arrangements? What are the ownership arrangements? What are the pricing arrangements? What are the local labour standards to be adopted? What are the local environmental standards to be adopted through whichever project is to be constructed, built or funded under Chinese investment arrangements? So I would take this conditional approach. When I look more broadly at the Belt and Road Initiative, and I went to its formal launch in Beijing in July last year and spoke at it, I think if we're serious more broadly about the global infrastructure deficit, and given that other sources of investment capital from private markets are not emerging, and that infrastructure investment is necessary to improve standards of living and increase stability in parts of the world which have less, then frankly it should be welcomed, but conditionally so, and walk into this with your eyes wide open in terms of what you as local countries and local communities want to get out of these particular projects.
Thank you. Then very last question, and I'm going to give a chance to whoever promises that is going to ask a very, very brief question. Do you still keep your hands up in the air? Okay, over there, lady over there.
Good evening. My name is Melissa, and although this has been a predominantly geopolitical discussion, I hope my question is not out of line. And it's an important and big issue that I don't see enough people talk about, certainly not enough politicians and political scientists. So what will be, what can be the response to the great job erosion? I mean, and we are seeing jobs disappearing at every level. We don't and we won't need as many traders because they're already powerful and efficient trading algorithms in line. But more importantly, low-skilled jobs such as driving, cashiers.
You made a promise.
Sorry. And just to preempt your cop-out, because I always hear, there will be other jobs. I mean, do you really believe a Walmart cashier can tomorrow become a Google engineer?
You did.
So seriously, what's going to be the response of the people?
Okay, so Kevin already answered this question, so I'm going to give a chance to Ian to briefly address it.
By the way, I didn't think I copped out. I said when Piketty's analysis was labour substitution is no longer occurring.
It was just a fancy way of answering.
It's a labour substitution no longer way of occurring, and AI hasn't really hit yet. We have a major problem with the distribution of wealth, and it must be attended to or it will fracture our democracies. I was very blunt and I think non-evasive in my answer to the question.
That was very intellectual, but it was an answer. But Ian,
okay.
gives us a gloves off answer to this.
A what?
A gloves off.
I'll do gloves off. Okay, gloves off. There'll be other jobs. I'm kidding. I mean, there will be other jobs, but it's not going to help these people. You're right. Look, everyone out there that is an optimist around this issue, a hands-off optimist, says, well, look, every time we've had an industrial revolution before, it's created wealth and new jobs. That's actually not true. I can think of one industrial revolution that actually completely destroyed a working population. It's the steam engine. Because we used to have a lot of horses with jobs, right? I mean, all over the industrialized world, and they were moving people, they were helping drive, they were helping power machines, all this sort of thing. Suddenly, you had the steam engine and you had related infrastructure, and within one generation, the horse population was decimated in the US and Europe to 10% of what it was. Now, the horse population has started coming back today for food and for leisure, entertainment. Now, imagine if it's not horses, right? Imagine if actually the skills that most human beings have within a generation are no longer necessary for work. I'm pretty funny, right? So I should be okay as entertainment. I don't know how tasty all you guys are, right? You said you wanted the gloves off.
Yep.
Here, I mean, seriously, the fact of the matter is that the history of the United States is one of a democracy, but not an inclusive democracy. I mean, blacks weren't part of the democracy to start. Women weren't part of the democracy. If you didn't have land, you weren't part of the democracy. Now, eventually, as we actually brought an integrated labor force into the country, we expanded the franchise and we brought blacks in and we brought women in. After World War II, you needed a bunch of, men were out. You brought women in, you gave them a lot of rights all of a sudden because you needed them. My expectation is that if the post-industrial or fourth industrial revolution actually means radically less jobs that many people are capable of doing in the next 20 years, they will lose the franchise. We will strip them from the rights that they presently enjoy. We will do it gradually. We may create universal basic income. They may have free 5G. We can create virtual realities for them that may be more attractive. We may be able to maintain stability in that way, but it will not look like the 21st century America or Europe that we presently live in. It will feel a lot less inclusive and a lot more divided. I don't think that people want to address this issue.
You just described Matrix to us. But anyway, it's a fascinating way to end this conversation.
There are no horses in the Matrix.
Yeah.
You notice that?
That's what I'm referring to.
Yeah.
You're talking about no horses. Now, on an optimistic and serious note, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Thank you, guys. It was a fascinating conversation. Now I invite you all to the cocktail party here so we can continue the conversation with our guests. Thank you.